Hey guys, what is up? Super K-Man Rocks here, and we are here for my NACL Week 4 overview and analysis video in the summer split. It's the final regular season week here for the NACL. By the end of today, we're going to know our 8 teams that have officially qualified for the playoffs, what order they will be in going into those playoff spots, and of course, the 2 teams that are eliminated that will not be playing in the playoffs, that will be 9th and 10th, and will have to go to the promotion relegation tournament for 2026. Excited to go over everything. I know you guys are as well. So let me know down in the comment section below. What did you expect to happen this week? Who did you expect to figure it out and end up making that final push to get into top 8? And what were the 2 teams that you expected to miss the playoffs? Did it live up to your expectations, or were you perhaps surprised by some of the outcomes? Of course, I'll be going over all of my opinions, but if you are new here, what we're going to do is go game by game across this super week, 15 best of ones to cover in this video, talking about the advantages and disadvantages that each team was able to generate. I'll be giving a player of the game and a dud of the game for each individual game that we cover, and at the end of the week, I will be giving a player of the week and a dud of the week to tie everything into a nice, neat little bow. No power rankings or standings to update you on. The only thing left after today will be the playoffs, and so we'll be previewing that playoff bracket, and I'll be giving some preliminary predictions for what I think is going to happen in round number 1. But again, most of today will be spent talking about the games we actually got. So without further ado, let's go ahead and jump into day number 1. And kicking off day number 1 was a very consequential matchup between 2 teams with very similar records. In fact, the same record. It was Dorado Gaming taking on Blue Otter, and Dorado Gaming is going to pick up the victory here. Obviously, this is very consequential because you're fighting it out to not be bottom 2. These teams sitting at 2 and 4 going into the week really needed to start picking up the steam now and not later, and I think Dorado is doing that. This team has obviously looked a lot better ever since coming off of what was an objectively terrible start to the split, not because of them, but because of their schedule. It just felt like they had to play all of the best teams in the entire league in the first couple of weeks, and then they finally got some reprieve. They're sitting at 3 and 4, only 1 game below 500 now, and I think they looked very, very good here. For Blue Otter on the other side, it's obviously frustrating to lose yet another game, but honestly, they've already been bailed out by the forfeit that they got last week over Conviction. You know, 2 and 5 might even be generous for where this team is at in terms of their position right now. I think they had some good things going for them in this game, but Dorado was absolutely better. This gives me a chance to kind of talk about the fact that I'm probably going to be a bit shorter on the games today, because instead of 10 best of ones, we have 15 best of ones. That means especially as we get later on in the week, I'm just basically going to be repeating myself in terms of where these, teams are at narrative wise, and so I'm probably going to speed through it a bit more than normal. Hopefully I keep myself to that so that this isn't like an hour and a half, 2 hour long video. But getting into the actual game itself here, player of the game for game 1 pretty much has to go to Sushi in the bot lane on the Kai'Sa. Didn't really feel like it could possibly go any other direction, as much as I liked the fact that Kaido was basically securing every objective and Ariana was pressuring out everything that Array was doing in the back half of the game. Hell, Mixture had all, like, the biggest plays this entire game came from Mixture's Alistair, both for good and for bad for Dorado. He had 2 plays in particular in this game that were absolutely nightmarish, but everything else, he was phenomenal throughout this. But it really came down to Sushi's damage, like him being able to step up and take over the team fights and the back half of this game, quite frankly, on the Kai'Sa, I think is really the difference maker for Dorado. And honestly, Sushi has kind of underperformed expectations, I would say. Not necessarily for me, but I know for a lot of other people throughout this split up until this point, because the expectations were so sky high from the limited time we saw him on Near Airport last split. I was much more cautious about what he was going to be in summer, not playing with players like Pobelter and Spica that were LTA caliber, but rather going to a team that I think was closer to mid to lower part of the table. I just kind of worried that Sushi wasn't going to have the same kind of performances, and I think that has kind of been proven correct. That being said, the talent is very much there. If you can get this guy into a great position to carry, especially if you can guide him through the early game, he still is a very dangerous player, and quite frankly, he was just way more active and way more prepared to step up and carry the game than someone like Array, who's been a very good AD carry on the other side of this matchup. Like I said, Kaido deserves a lot of credit for the smites he was able to put down. Ariana deserves a ton of credit for how he played these late fights on the Aurora, basically solo zoning out the entirety of the damage coming in from the enemy team, and Mixture made some of the biggest engages you will see on the Alistair. You know things are going well for Dorado when I'm talking about Shochi, their best player, last. Like, that is a really good sign, because it's not like the Ziggs was bad. Shochi's always going to be in a good position, and, he was taking towers, he was doing his thing, he was playing Ziggs, and so everything kind of clicking for Dorado. 40 minutes almost feels like it took a little bit too long, but that's mostly because this comp was just scaling up into their late game. And Blue Otter, to their credit, they didn't get completely rolled over. There were positive plays made by this team throughout this game. I think the solo laners in particular were quite aggressive. Kryra was doing a good job to capitalize on things that Dorado wasn't trying to pressure. I think trading for things across the map was a strength for Blue Otter in this game, but at the end of the day, they just didn't have the damage in the team fights to actually be able to come out and win it. Quacker was, basically the only one relied upon to do any damage throughout a lot of this game on the Rumble, and he can't 1v9 in that same kind of way, and that kind of comes down to Array, in my opinion, who is going to get the dead of the game on the Corki. I don't even think his individual plays were all that terrible. He just couldn't really accomplish anything. He's playing a shorter ranged AD carry, not that Kai'Sa necessarily outranges Corki or anything like that, but outside of the rockets, like, Corki needs to step up to deal a lot of his damage or to burst people down in these fights, and Ariana did a really great job of keeping him out of a lot of these exchanges. Array was doing less damage than a lot of his teammates throughout a lot of this game because he couldn't find positions to actually play, and I think that ended up being really consequential for Blue Otter. If you want to give that more to the credit of Dorado and less to the negative of Blue Otter, I understand that, but it's personally the direction I'm headed in. And then Rovex, the other player that I think kind of needs to be shouted out here for not having a great game. Honestly, Rovex has not been great across this split. I've expected a lot more. He was a player that I had high expectations for going into this split, but I also had those high expectations because he was playing with Chrome. So, circumstances are definitely different, but Rovex I just don't think has been the same kind of player in summer as he was last year. Samikin was fine. Cryro was even fine. Quacker looked okay. Like, Blue Water is a competent team, and I think that they are a team that should be competing for top 8. Do I think they're in that position right now? No. Like, you can see that in my power rankings. I put them below Dorado for a reason, and all Dorado did here was back that up by being the better team in the first game of the week. Getting themselves to 3 and 4 might be enough, despite everything, to get them into playoffs. Then moving on to our second game of day number 1, and it was a pretty top-tier matchup between Citadel Gaming and DarkZero, where DarkZero are going to pick up the win here. No real major surprise. As good as Citadel has been, they've kind of been a bit underwhelming in certain areas, and I think going up against the top teams, you can really start to see that a bit more, where it does feel like they're a bit disconnected from the top 4 right now. I think they are the best of the rest, and I think even in this game, we saw bits and pieces of that, especially with some objective steals coming in from Kenvi, but DarkZero was better in terms of their execution. They had a better game plan, and once that Smolder got online, full stacks at like 20 minutes into the game, it was basically donezo for this game moving forward, and that makes player of the game incredibly simple to talk about. It's Sajed who is getting player of the game for me on this Smolder. How could it possibly be anyone else? He ended up stacking up incredibly efficiently for DZ, and then once he hit that breakpoint, once he hit 225, it was over. There was no way to teamfight left for Citadel. I will say the only negative you can give Sajed in terms of like a player of the game nod is that almost all of his pop-off teamfight moments were him just playing front to back and the rest of the team really doing a lot of that setup and creating the avenues for him to take over, but that's their job. Like, I don't know what to tell you, man. That's what they're supposed to do. Sajed is still the character that has to go out and deal the damage, and that's exactly what he ended up doing here. Sajed has been phenomenal. I would actually argue he's been the best AD carry in the league so far this split, although, I don't know, man. Viper's been really fun to watch. Like, I'm not going to sit here and say Viper's better than Sajed. It's just been a very funny conversation to have, but really, Sajed has been phenomenal. He has taken that next leap, I would say, with Maryville, with DarkZero, and kind of become that big top-tier prospect that I think FlyQuest really hoped he would be last year. Rest of the team was good. Toasty, I thought, was really consistent on the Orianna. K had a couple of awesome ultimates on this Rumble. I really think he's going to go a bit too under the radar for just how good of a game he had. His laning phase was great. His late game was great. When he wins, he looks excellent. He's been decently bad in some of their losses. Again, like, it's very rare that DarkZero just feels like they're getting outskilled, but it has happened every once in a while, and K at times has been a player that has been exploited in that regard, but this was another really good performance from him that kind of backed up some of that week 1 tape that we saw. If you're getting this kind of showcase from top and bot lane, that is a really good sign. Kisno was fine. Just wish he would have actually, smited some objectives and not let them get stolen by the Maokai and Kenvi on the other side to give over Soul basically for free. And then Zyko had a couple of over-eager exchanges, I would say, throughout this game, but for the most part, when it really mattered, he started to lock in and play really well down the stretch, especially once that Smolder hit the stack count. So for DarkZero, happy to see them feel really strong, right? Like, this is a team I think a lot of people started writing off because they lost Yuji, because they lost Spyrax, because they lost Zamudo. Like, this was a team I think a lot of people were a little bit more concerned about coming into this split. I still think that they are close to being a top tier roster and still have a huge target on their back for being a top 2 or a top 1 team if everything were to go right. But for Citadel on the other side, unfortunately, it really does feel like they've slotted into their spot of just kind of being the best of the rest. Now, that's not a terrible place for them to be, but I want to see them compete with a team like DarkZero. Now, credit to Kenvi because I thought he was the most relevant player in this game for Citadel, again, if only for those steals. But the draft is very funny. Ezreal mid for Bradley, I think, is obviously a very aggressive play to try and get this double marksman going as quickly as possible. Two marksman champions in particular that really want to try and poke and skirmish as quickly as possible, but neither of them really ended up getting online, and you couldn't really stop the Smolder from stacking once DarkZero ended up getting leads in the early game, but a lot of that came down to individual matchups. To me, that points to 2 players, Diamond in the support position and Philip on the top side. Philip being the one who was going to get dead of the game for me. I don't think he was like explicitly terrible, rather K just had a really good game on the Rumble. The Ambessa couldn't really get going in the early game, and that champ I don't think scales nearly as effortlessly deadly as everyone wants to make her out to be. So overall, it just felt like Philip kind of struggled to find an impact on the game as a whole, but I don't think Diamond played particularly well. Hard to find engages on the Alistair when you're trying to engage on a front line that's perfectly peeling for a Smolder. There's just no access to any of the backline in any of these exchanges, but you do have to at least call it out. Everybody else was fine. Like, Kenvy's fighting was actually pretty bad, but again, it's just hard to critique him too much when he was the one keeping Citadel in this game. Overall, it just feels like they were a bit outclassed, and that's not surprising, but it is, I think, at least for me, a bit disappointing, because especially after their win over Supernova last week, I really thought that this team might be finding their footing, but we're back down to earth here, and you know, number 5, I don't think is a terrible place for them to be. And for DarkZero on the other side, like, this is still a very good team, and again, I don't want people to underestimate them. There is a real shot they're competing to win the entire league. Then moving on to our third game of day number 1, and this one was not really a surprise, especially with the form that these two teams are in. Conviction taking on CCG Esports, and Conviction picking up the dominant victory, the sub 30-minute victory, sub 28-minute victory, if you want to be even more specific. They look incredible. Like, I can't stress this enough. Right now, it is not a top 3 in the NACL. It is a top 4. Conviction has a strong case for being a team that very well could promote into the LTA going into next year with this roster. It's actually absurd just how well they're playing together right now, because they're just hands checking everybody. They have macro pieces here and there that I think are elevating the team, specifically Perry, Evolved, and Stunt, who I think are really doing a lot of the heavy lifting in that regard. But the hands of players like Viper and TF Blade and Perry and, you know, Evolved to a lesser extent, not that he has bad hands, just, you know, I'll talk about his role on this team as we continue to go along. It's ridiculous. It's showing so much for Conviction. Genuinely, this team from a pure, you know, tape perspective looks like a top 2 team in the NACL. The only hang up is the fact that they lost to DarkZero, but they have kind of rolled everything else. That other loss was a forfeit because they couldn't get Tournament Realm to load. So it's one of those things where Conviction is looking dominant, and CCG are looking kind of like a disaster right now. They had a miserable week 3, really a disastrous one in terms of their production, and they've gotten themselves into this spot where they go in to their final 2 games at 2-5. You know, outside of the upper echelon, they could be a team that very much ends in the bottom 2 if they keep playing like this. Let's go ahead and talk about it. Viper kind of has to be player of the game for this one. He is a psychopath on the Vayne, and I get that he has a lot of experience playing this champion because he is a top lane player first and foremost. I guess not so much anymore, right? Like, he is an AD carry player. I don't want to make it seem like he's not, but obviously Viper, a former top lane pro, had probably gotten a lot of experience on Vayne on the top side before he ever ended up playing her full-time as an AD carry, but he plays her like a top laner. That I will definitely say. He is full engaging into every single exchange. He is looking to be the primary engager, the playmaker, the fight starter, and that's just not something you ever really see out of AD carries, and quite frankly, because he has the hands to back it up, he gets away with so much at this level. Do I think that that's something that would benefit him going forward against top tier teams? I'm not sure, right? Like, maybe, but maybe not. Like, it's hard to really get a good idea of it. All I know is that he doesn't play like any other AD carry in the world. He plays like a top laner who's been put into the bot lane. Obviously, that's exactly what he is, but it's super fun to watch, and quite frankly, he's obliterating games with that style right now. Nobody seems to really have an answer for the kind of aggression that he is putting out into these games, so credit to him. Stunt was unbreakable throughout this entire game on the Braum. Like, genuinely, there was no way for CCG to ever output damage. You're having to get through a Braum shield, a Pantheon shield, Gwen going immune, like all of this stuff just to try and get to Viper, who's playing super aggro and blowing you up at the start of the fight anyways if you're even remotely mispositioned. You have a Nico as your primary engage against a player who is actively looking to kill any squishy. It's really difficult to find engage angles if you're CCG, and I think part of that is Stunt, part of that is Viper, part of that is Perry, which we will talk about, but Stunt definitely deserves his flowers. I think TF Blade had a phenomenal game on the top side on the Gwen, one of his better games in a while. He's really found his form. I don't think it was necessarily there when this team was winning in the first couple weeks, but week 3 onwards, the past 3 games, I would say, or I guess 2 games, I would say he really has been exceptionally good. Hopefully that form is sustainable. Perry has been pretty good for this team. I think the Pantheon could have been a tad bit more effective, but I think that's mostly because, like I said earlier, Perry is clearly taking a much more macro-focused approach to how these games are going, and I think his experience at this level is helping them a lot. But Evolved has impressed me so much, and I really don't want to overstate the impact that he's having on the game because he's not actively carrying with his damage. I think it's worth noting he is actively carrying with his map movements. You can argue, like, there is an argument right now that there is no mid laner who is playing quite as active on the map as Evolved is, and he's not even doing it by generating these gigantic leads himself and then, you know, hopefully carrying the game. He's not playing this like solo queue selfish style. He's playing perfectly off the rest of his team. He's playing low resource, very facilitative, and he's doing it at a ridiculously high level. I did not know he had this in him as a player, and it's really helped the rest of this team, which is basically full of carries everywhere else. So Conviction just looks so scary right now, and CCG clearly had no answer. I've always been lower on this team. I was lower on them coming into the split. I had them at number 7 in my power rankings when a lot of people had them top 5 in terms of their projections, and unfortunately, it does look like that's going to be a bit more accurate. They are really, really struggling right now, and it's not one player. It's kind of across the board where they're just not really finding any advantages. Young, for me, is going to get done of the game here in their first game of the week on the Syndra. I don't think he was terrible, but I do think he was ineffective. Like I said, it's very difficult to do damage into this comp, and Young was almost entirely useless, especially if he's not hitting scatter on a primary target at the start of a fight. Then there's basically nothing that the Syndra does from that point onwards that actually is relevant throughout the rest of the game, and I think Young ended up really suffering from that. Crimson, I think, had quite a poor game on the Cassante. On the top side, I know there's been a bit more hate for Crimson as of late. I'm not necessarily there. I think this guy is fine at a tier 2 level, but I just don't think he's a star quite yet. Music obviously struggled, I would say, in the jungle in terms of how things ended up going. He tried to be more aggressive alongside Fadachan in this game. It just didn't work out, and we already talked about it. Shogo wasn't able to deal any damage in this game. You know, Shogo really is kind of a late game team fighter. He's not a particularly good laner, and that really cost him against a very aggressive player who pushes advantages like Viper. So not a great game for CCG, and now they're kind of in the danger zone at 2-5, but this is a big win for Conviction. They're likely sitting at 6-1 if they don't forfeit that game against Blue Otter. It's not guaranteed. Nothing is guaranteed in the NACL, but still at 5-2, this is absolutely one of the teams you have to look out for to win the league. Then moving on to our 4th game of day number 1, and it was a worst versus first matchup that went as you expected. Supernova taking on Vancouver Impact, with Supernova picking up the win. I believe they were already confirmed for playoffs. Like, there was no world where they could even miss that, but this puts them in a really strong position to basically guarantee them the number 1 seed moving forward. They are the only team sitting at 6-1 heading into the final 2 games, and you know what? They've looked incredible, and they did it with a sub in this one. No Hoarder, he was taking exams while this was happening, and so he was not available for this game. Again, another great example of why this NACL schedule is very questionable, to say the absolute least. But X-Royal is a North American player that is not playing in the OQs, that is willing to sub in here against some former teammates, by the way, on Dorado Gaming, and Zev and Nukes down in the bot lane for Vancouver Impact, and he does more than step up. He dominates this game. X-Royal is going to get my player of the game here. You know, he's not really a player I expected to dominate like this. I think it's fair to basically plug and play anybody on the top side and expect them to do well, but this was a genuinely great Gwen game. Now, Dragoon made mistake after mistake after mistake. This was a pretty terrible game from Dragoon, who has been, you know, I don't want to try and be too harsh because it's the NACL, but it's not been a good split for Dragoon. He has not looked like a tier 2 caliber player really at any point throughout this split, and X-Royal comes out here and, you know, pun not intended because of the set, but like body slams him from the top rope. Like, it's absolutely ridiculous how strong this Gwen game was. The laning phase was so catastrophically terrible for top lane for Vancouver Impact that it basically made the game unplayable. But part of that, you do just have to give credit to X-Royal. We've seen kind of the sub buff be real in basically every region. You know, go watch the LPL if you really want to get a full example of that. You know, links obviously to LPL English in the description as per usual. Self-plug, very, very relevant. But X-Royal obviously comes in here and just dominates, just looks fantastic. I had to give him player of the game just for the circumstance and for the fact that he was the most aggressive and probably dominant player in the game. But really, if you wanted to give player of the game to Dardoch in the jungle, I think there's a strong argument that he actually was the best player on the Rift in this game. The Trundle was excellent, really just completely owned every single objective and every single play throughout the entire game. You know, Dardoch is one of those players that when he is working, when he is on, he looks incredible, and I'll be honest, I think this is the best he's looked since leaving Tier 1. Like, genuinely, I think you can go back to the last 3-4 years of gameplay from Dardoch. I don't think he's ever been as good as this in Tier 2, and that's a really high compliment to Dardoch, a player who I think has been solid at this level before, but even going back to CCG in the spring split, this guy was running games. He was dominating everything, and I think he has very much continued that. Blaze Olive was good. Breezy was really good here. Scary Jerry took a full backseat role on the Varus, but kind of necessary because the rest of the map was just kind of running things. It's, you know, kind of good to see somebody be able to actually take some resources away from Jerry and have it work out. So Supernova looks incredible. They absolutely dominated, even with a substitute top laner. And then for Vancouver Impact on the other side, it's just not looking good. I get that there was some momentum coming out of last week with them being able to pick up their first win off the back of Shimmer coming in, but a couple all of these players are just not looking good right now. Dragoon's got to get done of the game. You know, again, I don't really want to be too harsh, but it has just not looked good at all for Dragoon on the top side of the map. He has not looked particularly competent as a top laner at this level. You know, we've seen him be a lot better than this at tier 2, in tier 2 in the past for, you know, other teams. It just isn't there. Right now, this has been a bad split, and I think the increase in quality in tier 2 has really affected, you know, these kind of borderline tier 2 players, and Dragoon, I think, has really struggled to adapt. Again, I hope he can figure things out. It's just not working right now. Sudsy was looking great at the start of the split, or at least better than the rest of the team. He was looking like the best player on Vancouver Impact. I'm not quite sure that's the case anymore. You know, Shimmer probably is the best player on this team, but Nuke's also really struggling to find those same engage angles he found in the qualifier, the open qualifier tournament. Zev, I think, was always a player we expected to struggle at this level. He's been fine, generally speaking. He wasn't the problem on the Senna. Neither was Shimmer on the Wukong, even if he did get completely out jungled. Most of that had to do with the fact that it's really hard to play when you have 3 losing lanes. Just not an easy jungle matchup there. But who's really surprised by this outcome? You had the worst team in the league that kind of got rolled, and you had the best team in the league that, even with the substitute, had enough firepower to make things happen. There was no shock here other than the fact that Supernova is in a great spot to get that #1 seed. But then moving on to our 5th and final game of day number 1. Here we had a matchup between Winthrop University and Luminosity Gaming, where Luminosity are going to pick up the victory. Again, no real surprise here, but Winthrop once again goes down fighting in a loss. They've done this so many times across this year, it's actually astounding. This team almost always looks competitive despite what the result ends up being. And that sometimes includes their wins as well, where they end up not looking quite as dominant as maybe you would want. This is just a team that knows how to play a close game, that is for sure. But Luminosity definitely slammed the door on them in the late game. They understood their comp incredibly well, and quite frankly, there just wasn't enough options on Winthrop's side to be able to win this. You're playing entirely around a Lucian. You have Galio Wukong as a mid-jungle duo, and you've got Emilio in the support position. It's mobility or bust, which has worked for Winthrop at other times throughout this year, but Tomio, Tactical, Zazel, they were willing to put the stoppage on that. We will say that as we continue to talk more. For Luminosity, player of the game is kind of up for you to decide. I think, honestly, it's whatever you feel. I'm giving it to Tactical because I honestly think he's getting undervalued for just how well he played this game. I think a lot of people are going to point to Tomio, rightfully so, for being the one to constantly find engage angles onto mobility. And while I think Tomio you could definitely make the argument he was the most relevant player in this game, because I think that, you know, strongly he was, Tactical's gameplay on this Kai'Sa in terms of his positioning was phenomenal. Like, this is the Tactical that we saw last split that I really felt was tier 1 quality. He knows exactly when to play a little bit slower. He knows exactly when to play a little bit faster. And I think he just had such a great understanding of exactly where he should be at any point in the game that I just want to give him some credit for this kind of performance. And I do want to give him player of the game. But again, if you want to give it to Tomio, he's been phenomenal throughout this entire split. He was excellent last week for this team in week 3. He's been just as good here in week 4, at least so far. The Vi, obviously, the big piece that really shuts down the Lucian win condition on the other side, because if Lucian gets ulted, the game is over. The fight is over. And it's pretty easy just to point and click and press R if you are Vi. Even Ahri obviously can get themselves involved in that play. And Sandy was fine. Not the most active, but still a good game. Zazel had a couple of the big moments, the big pop blossoms, the dopamine plays, as I think it's worth calling out. But outside of that, I think Zazel was mostly just along for the ride. He's been excellent throughout this split. I think he's been better in summer than he was in spring, but this maybe isn't the best game to kind of exemplify that. Like I said, Insanity was good and Fake God was also fine, but basically all of Luminosity knowing exactly what to do in the late game, understanding their win condition super well and executing on it. And then for Winthrop on the other side, poor mobility just didn't get the chance to carry the game. Like, that is what it is. They set everything up for this Lucian to be the piece that could actively carry them, and he could never play a single team fight throughout this entire game. He is dead of the game because so much was on him and he wasn't able to really put that forward. It's kind of similar to the Array dead of the game that we gave out in the first game of the day, but a little bit different because mobility was even more important, I would say, to the comp as a whole than Array was on the Corki. This Lucian just never really got to do the thing it was looking to do. Now, part of that is the rest of the team. For as good as Denethor's scoreline looks, Gnar was always ulting after the Luminosity engage, and that's almost always a problem. If you're not playing proactive with this Winthrop comp, you're almost always going to lose. You need to be the one that's engaging or pushing forward first, whether that be Gnar or Wukong or Galio. Someone needs to go in first on Winthrop to create these advantages. If you're playing on the back foot, you're almost always going to lose these fights, and Denethor, I think, really struggled with that down the stretch of the game. I think Wilson definitely deserves some blame for that. Sword, I think, was just kind of along for the ride. Hard to play Galio when your carry is not, you know, playable, and same thing for only 35 on the Milio. Really hard to play this champ when your Lucian's just getting blown up at every given opportunity because there's no way to actively protect him. You can cleanse one thing, but you can't cleanse everything coming out from the side of Luminosity. but overall, it was just, a hard game to play for Winthrop, and they ended up folding because they couldn't quite play it out. And for Luminosity, they executed on their comp well, got themselves to 5-2. That basically guarantees them playoffs and puts them in a strong spot. They might not be the number one team that they thought they were going to be going into the split, but they're pretty damn close right now. But then moving on now to day number 2, our middle day for the Super Week instead of our final day. We kicked off day 2 with the matchup between DarkZero and Vancouver Impact, where DarkZero was able to pretty easily pick up the victory. No real problems in this one. They were the better team across the board. Really nice win from them. No real surprise, but the big takeaway here is not just DarkZero getting to 6-2, which is a great spot for them. Again, I'm not surprised to see them at this record, but I think with all of the parity right now in the NACL, it's nice to see at least one team be able to consistently win best of ones against teams that they absolutely should beat. DarkZero's only 2 losses this split have come against Supernova and Luminosity, the 2 best teams in the league. They've actively beaten everyone else that they're supposed to beat. No random dropping of games that even Supernova has done at the top of the standings. But Vancouver Impact on the other side, unfortunately now at 1-7, is officially done. There is no universe in which they can end up getting outside of the bottom 2. Theoretically, I believe they can still get 9th if they end up, pulling off some sort of major upset on the final day, but the realistic path and the reality likely for this team is going to be a 10th place finish, last place. We all kind of saw that coming going into the split in terms of what this roster was, but you do have to give some credit where, credit is due for this roster. We'll talk about it a bit more after their final game, but some things to at least note in this one. Talking strictly about the game, though, starting with DarkZero, player of the game for me is going to go to K on the top side. I know this isn't exactly the most common pick here because he wasn't even an option for the MVP on the actual broadcast, one of the 3 people to vote for, but, the almost pentakill at the end of the game ended up being absolutely huge for DarkZero, and quite frankly, the Aatrox was massive in this performance. I think his laning has continued to be ginormous, and I know Dragoon's not exactly the best laner in the entire league. In fact, I think you could make the argument that he is the weakest top laner in the entire league right now, but K decimated him in lane, was up by a ton, ended up controlling a lot of the early phase, and then obviously took over in that late fight, ended up getting 4 kills towards the back half of the game. I think he's not getting nearly enough credit for how well he's playing right now. I think his positioning and his general aggression have brought a lot to DarkZero. I don't think he's Zamudo, but I don't think he's all that far off from being a hugely positive player for what this team is. He might be closer to what Zamudo was in 2024, which I think is honestly a pretty decent comparison for what K can be. The rest of the team was great. Toasty absolutely deserves player of the game if you do want to give it to him. The mid gap in this game was ginormous, and Toasty took full advantage of that. You could argue that Toasty was the more consistent player than K throughout this, but I think K had the bigger moment, and both of them were absolutely phenomenal, so it really is up to you. But the solo laners stepping up here today, Sajet and Zyko, I think we're good. Zyko, you have to report at least a little bit for the fact that he stole the penta at the end of the game on the recon. Didn't, I guess, underestimated the amount of damage that K would do off of the passive and just ended up stealing the kill. It's obviously very funny, but Zyko, outside of that, had a really good game on the recon. Sajet is obviously just so good. When he goes deathless, this team is almost always going to win. His positioning is so flawless, and when he gets to play something like Xayah that gives himself self-peel tools, it's really good. Kizno was solid. I'd love to see him be a little bit more aggressive around these objectives, but at this point we're nitpicking. DarkZero was so much better than Vancouver Impact, and unfortunately, the big story here is that VI is done, that this is unfortunately their final chance, that was their final shot to actually, try and fight for a top 8 spot. They needed to win both of the final 2 games, not capable of doing that, and it is what it is. Nobody's particularly surprised to see this team likely get 10th, but there are some things to take away. I think Shimmer has been an upgrade to this team, and Zev has honestly been better than I thought he would be. I don't think he's been a disaster at this level. Even Nukes, I don't think has really been that big of a problem, but, Sudsy, who looked good at the beginning of this split, has had a terrible week so far. He's getting dead of the game here. He got mega gapped, astro gapped by Toasty in the mid lane. When you're playing Talia and you have 0 pressure on the map, you're down in gold, down in resources, and you're not shoving and roaming, that champion is just not going to be able to accomplish anything. Really unfortunate circumstance for Sudsy. Again, a player that I really liked at the beginning of this split. I think there is something in there for him, but, wasn't able to get that out, and I think he got worse over the course of this split as the team kind of, ended up faltering a bit more, probably lost a lot of confidence. Dragoon, unfortunately, has just not been good for this team as well. Basically, every top laner who's gone into Vancouver Impact has had one of their best games of the entire split. It is what it is, right? Sometimes it happens, sometimes it doesn't. But for Vancouver Impact, they're at least going to have the chance to go out on a high note, maybe upsetting and, spoilering somebody else's chances of being able to make it into the playoffs, or at least, have a better seeding going into the playoffs, but they will not get to play for themselves at this point. But DarkZero very much fighting it out for one of those upper tier spots. The difference between getting the 2 and the 3 seed might actually be massive depending on where the tiebreakers end up breaking down. So with DarkZero keeping their foot on the gas, they're in a really good spot to still be one of the better teams. Then moving on now to our second game of day number 2, and this is a very, very big win for the team that picked it up. It was Dorado Gaming taking on CCG Esports, and CCG get a very, very necessary, much-needed victory here, because if they didn't, they were honestly going to be in a pretty bad spot moving forward. At 2-5, they were looking kind of dangerous after a couple of losses that they probably didn't want to take, and so getting a win over Dorado, getting to 3 wins, does actually put them in a pretty good spot. They're going into one of the weaker teams in the league on the final day in Blue Otter, a team also fighting for their spot. And again, like, I can't stress enough just how important it was for CCG to pick up this win. For Dorado, it's obviously frustrating to not move to 500. They had the opportunity to do that for the first time all split long, but it's just not meant to be. They ended up getting outplayed here, and I think it's quite fair to say that CCG just had better macro on the map and ended up utilizing their resources just a tad bit better. But let's go ahead and talk about it. Early invade coming in from Dorado, it really was an attempt to try and generate an insurmountable lead with the Pantheon and Talia, because you want to play off the power that those two have in the early game. However, CCG weather the storm well, and quite frankly, Dorado just don't play all that well in the mid game, and it ends up creating this situation where one gigantic mistake, Kaido ends up flashing onto a clone for the Wukong, and all of a sudden the game becomes very difficult to win because the fight ends up going awry. CCG get a big lead, and they never really look back. Music is going to get player of the game for me on this Wukong. It really did feel like his map movements were superior to everybody else in the game when you were watching this, and that includes his own team. Not to say his own team was bad or anything like that, but rather I just think that he was by far the most influential player on the Rift in terms of how much he was actively creating for himself and for his team, like I said. Music's a player I have doubted before. I've not necessarily given him the benefit of the doubt so far in the NACL. I think part of that is unfair of me. I know he has this reputation of being a great shot caller, and that's not something I can quantify nearly as much watching these games. It's always something that I try to keep in mind because they would know way better than I do, of course. Like these players who have played with him and you know, a lot of the, you know, analysts and casters that have been able to speak with a lot of these players, they're just naturally going to have more information on how much a player brings. I've been waiting to see Music take that next leap into being a great player at this level. I don't know if it's necessarily happened, but again, this was a really good look. Again, the player he reminds me the most of is someone like Sheo over in the LEC. I know that's a weird comparison, but again, I think their play styles are very similar in terms of how they play the game. Nice game overall for Music. I think the rest of the team was good as well. Crimson ends up getting player of the game. I felt that was a bit confusing. I thought he played well. He was certainly, you know, eventful in this game. I think he did a lot of positive things, but I don't think he was more impactful on the map than Music was. I think Shogo and Fadachan had a better argument than Crimson did for player of the game. Shogo obviously because he goes deathless, and that's always a pretty good thing. And Fadachan was everywhere, was involved in basically every positive play that happened for CCG. I think he's almost getting undervalued for this game. Young continues to be more of a background player for CCG, but again, picking up a win at any cost is a really big positive, and this was a team effort. I don't think anybody really underperformed here for CCG. And then for Dorado on the other side, Kaido is the pretty obvious choice for dead of the game. Unfortunately, with that Pantheon, a champion that most people are considering incredibly strong right now, he just wasn't able to push the game forward nearly as much as you would want. He makes one gigantic mistake with his flash engage, and all of a sudden the game is kind of out of control. The Pantheon ended up being kind of useless, and you know, we've seen this before out of Kaido. I think he can be a pretty feast or famine player in terms of individual game results. That's the kind of variance that you naturally get in a best of one. You don't really get, you know, time to adapt and evolve throughout a series or anything like that. So Music, I think, just being a little bit more proactive on the map ended up being really big for CCG. I don't think Shochi is having the best week of all time. I think he was pretty good on day one, but this was not like the Shochi that I think I had grown to really appreciate on this channel. He wasn't really playing the map all that aggressively. I'm hopeful that he's going to be back in the next game. Mixture, I think, is at times struggling. Ariana and Sushi, I think, were generally not the problem here, but again, Dorado just kind of felt out-macroed. It really felt like a grand scheme kind of thing. They had a plan going in the early stages, and once that plan ended up not working out, it didn't really feel like they had a counterpunch, and it certainly didn't feel like they knew how to adapt from that point onwards. That's kind of the case with a lot of teams that, you know, include a lot of younger players that don't have as much tier 2 experience, or I guess inexperienced players is probably better than saying younger, because age doesn't really matter as much as actual, you know, tangible experience at this level does. But Dorado, you know, now in a more difficult spot at 3-5, and CCG is matching them at 3-5, but both teams in a good spot to control their own destiny going into the final day. If they can just win their final games or hope for a couple of really key outcomes from some other teams, then it should be fine for both of them moving forward. Then moving on now to our third game, and technically our middle game of the entire week here. And we had Winthrop University taking on Supernova, and despite how well Winthrop ends up playing for a majority of this game, it's Supernova who comes out on top, picks up the win, gets themselves to 7-1, and I believe all but locks themselves as the #1 seed going into playoffs. It's very likely that obviously they end at 8-1. Even if they end at 7-2, they're in a very good spot to still grab that #1 seed, depending on tiebreakers. So credit to Supernova. They look phenomenal right now. This looks like the best team in the NACL. I think a lot of people are going to have them as favorites going into playoffs, and I certainly understand why. For Winthrop, though, what an effort from them. That's back-to-back games that they play incredibly well and just can't come away with the victory. I think this game was even closer. This is probably the best game of the week in terms of the actual closeness and like down to the wireness of the gameplay, and it's just unfortunate for Winthrop, who now sits at 3-5. Again, a very dangerous record to sit at depending on where things land, because if you are a team with 3 wins, you could very likely be bottom 2 or ninth in terms of how these tiebreakers end up breaking down. You don't even want to be in that discussion right now. So let's go ahead and talk about it. For Supernova, player of the game is going to go to a Blaze Olive. I really couldn't give it to anybody else. The rise was huge in this game, not only in terms of the laning phase, where ABO was much stronger than Sword in terms of generating leads and generally just creating advantages for the team as a whole, but also the Realm Warps. Like, that's what a lot of people are going to look at, the Realm Warping of Breezy into a lot of these fights, and the Alistair into a lot of these exchanges, just opening up the entire map for creative engages from Supernova. Like, the Realm Warps were absolutely ginormous. He was machine gun rise in terms of damage in the back half of this game, ends up leading the game in kills, I guess tied with mobility, but really great performance from a Blaze Olive, and he has been everything he was advertised to be and then some for Supernova. I think he's been everything he was for Fearx Starforge last year. So if they were looking for the top 1 mid laner in the NACL, they probably got him, because that's just who a Blaze Olive seems to be right now. He's kind of proven that over the past 2 years. And then for the rest of the team here, I think that there are a lot of performances to shout out as well. Breezy was excellent. You can only have that combo with ABO if Breezy is willing to try and find those engage angles on Alistair with those Realm Warps, and I think a lot of those one-way trips ended up with Breezy kind of sacrificing his life in order to do something positive for the team, but that really ended up working out for Supernova. Some of those engages were perfect from him. I think Dardoch had another great game. He's having a phenomenal year. Again, Dardoch and ABO, I think, are both in the MVP conversation in terms of how things are breaking down for Supernova. Jerry was good. Hoarder got targeted so much early game on this Vladimir to try to get him shut down, but the game went long enough where he was useful anyways in the late game, which is always a really good feeling as a Vlad player. So for Supernova, obviously, this is a good win. 7-1 puts you in a great spot. For Winthrop, I am a bit sad for them because it feels like almost all of their losses this split have been so close and they've been so competitive, but they're just a team that goes down swinging and not one that necessarily wins the fights. It's really, really unlucky to watch, but they played well once again. I think Denethor's early games have been stellar throughout this entire split. I honestly think he's taken a leap in terms of what he was last split and what he was last year towards what he is right now. I think he's playing better right now than he ever has before, and I think that's a really good thing. It's just not enough. Mobility was put in a good spot on Misfortune, but the bullet times can only be so effective with the kind of comp that Supernova have on the other side. You need this Victor to be able to carry you in the late game, and Sword was just really behind the 8 ball in terms of generating resources. I think he had the lowest KP in the entire game, which is never good as a Victor. It's never the situation you want to find yourself in. Wilson was generally pretty good, I would say, all things considered, on the Wukong. Obviously, again, if you're able to land that smite and not give over Chem Soul, maybe things are a bit different, but it is what it is. And then dead of the game for me is going to go to only 35. Not even entirely his fault, but it's just one of those games where Braum becomes more and more useless as the game continues to go along. It was really tough for only 35 to be useful in the back half of this game, and I quite frankly just don't think he was. I think they were fighting this game with the hope that they could get a good Victor ultimate off and just didn't really find the angles to do so. So Winthrop looking incredibly competitive in the loss, but just not having enough firepower, and now sitting at 3-5, needing to win on the final day. And Supernova sitting, like I said, at 7-1, likely your best team in the NACL going into playoffs. And I think everybody right now is looking at them as favorites. But then moving on to game number 4 of day 2, and this was a really big one. 2 of the top 4 teams going head-to-head. Conviction taking on Luminosity Gaming, and Luminosity is going to pick up the victory. It's 2 5-2 teams, but only one of them is moving to 6-2, and that is, of course, your defending champions. Conviction has looked great across this split, and they will have the chance to prove that even more so the day after this, but it's quite a gauntlet at the end of the regular season for them. As great as their record has looked, quite frankly, it should be at 6-1. That's because they have not faced the top 2 2 teams in the league just yet, and Luminosity kind of showcasing, okay, you are pretty good, and you have a lot of things going for you that I think are positive, but in clutch moments, we are just a little bit better, and especially that early game coming in from Luminosity, it was so clean and so well executed. You just got to give them credit, and obviously the Otacon steal ends up being really relevant throughout the back half of this game as well. So credit to Luminosity, player of the game. I kind of avoided giving it to him for the first one because I felt like Tactical wasn't getting enough credit, but how can I not give it to him here? It's Tomio getting player of the game on the Maokai. This is his signature champion. I think people forget that. You know, I've seen a lot of people talking about, oh, like Tomio's, you know, doing a great job dropping ego and just playing facilitators for this team. When he's at his best, this is always who Tomio has been. He has never really been like a true carry player at the tier 2 level. He's been elite at things like Maokai and Sejuani, specifically Maokai. Like, this champion has always been his number one, his 1A type of champion, and he continues to showcase that. Obviously, the Vi was great earlier this week as well, but Maokai, like Tomio Maokai just hits a bit different, and you can see that in the early game. This was a perfect early game from Tomio. I don't use that term lightly. Like, I genuinely just don't think you could have done anything better in the early game as Maokai here than what Tomio did. He kept his team in the game. He constantly set up around objectives perfectly. He got his laners into good positions. It's just one of those games where you have to say jungle diff, and it's not even to the fault of Perry, who I thought played really well. It's just that Tomio was doing everything in the early game that he needed to do in order to get his team a lead. Credit to him. But of course, I'm not just going to credit Tomio. He's not the only player who ended up playing well here. Insanity deserves a major shout out on the Corki as well, not only because he was the damage and the range really in a lot of these fights, but more specifically because he steals the Otacon. That is a massive game-breaking play for Conviction. It kind of ends their chances of being able to come back here, and the fact that, you know, Insanity is able to pick it up, again, it's just a massive play coming in for Luminosity and for Insanity, who's been much better, in my opinion, in summer than he was in spring. Again, not that he was bad or anything in the spring split, but rather he's just been really, really good in summer, and I think he's certainly been more consistent in the regular season outside of the playoffs. Tactical and Zeyzal continued to be great. Zeyzal is a huge playmaker on the Nico. Fake God was fine on the Cassante. Didn't really need to touch on him too much, but this really was the week of Tomio for Luminosity, and we're not even on the third game yet. And then for Conviction on the other side, it's just one of those games where you went up against one of the best teams in the league, and you kind of just got outplayed. Like, there's not really a lot to talk about. I don't even think this team made that many mistakes. I like their draft. I like their game plan. It just didn't work out. They weren't as good as Luminosity. TF Blade's going to get dead of the game for me. This Scion was overly useless, like, you know, at least wholly in terms of how the game ended up progressing. TF Blade's been very good on Scion. It's been one of the big positive progressions that I've seen him make over the course of this year, comparing like week 1 or even like OQ's TF Blade versus like now in terms of what he is. He's like realized just how strong tanks are in, you know, competitive plays. Talked about that previously. Unfortunately, the Scion was not in a position to actually do anything this game because he was getting blown up at the start of every fight. The range advantage on Luminosity was very difficult to deal with, and that's with a Victor on your side. But again, Evolved has not really taken like a carry-oriented role on this team, and I think that actually came back to bite them in this game because you're really kind of relying on the Varus to kind of step up and do a lot of damage, and it just didn't really, it wasn't enough. You weren't able to break through the Maokai, you weren't able to break through the Cassante as the game continued to go along. I think that there are some things you can nitpick about Conviction's play. Again, I think you need to be a lot more secure around how you set up objectives and how you control space. I know Maokai's really good at being able to kind of thwart that. Nico, as well, is a very good champion at being able to kind of turn that on its head, but it's the small things like that that I think are going to be the difference between this team genuinely competing to win the league, because I think they have that kind of upside, versus them just being a top 4 team that's not quite as good as the upper echelon of teams. That's the kind of stuff that will make that difference, but Conviction is still fine. I think we'll have to see how they end up performing on the last day, because it doesn't get easier from here in terms of the regular season. But nice win for Luminosity. Technically, I believe they're still in contention to get that number 1 seed, but likely they're just going to be going into the playoffs incredibly hot, just like DarkZero, and I think that that is a good place for them to be at. But that's going to bring us to our final game of the second day here of the final week, and closing out day 2 was a matchup between Citadel Gaming and Blue Otter, where Citadel are going to pick up their 4th win of the split. They're going to move to 4-4, and honestly, they're in a pretty great spot right now heading into the final day. This guarantees them playoffs. 4 games is enough to get you in. 3 games looks like it's going to be the cutoff, the barrier, depending on how things end up going on the final day, but Citadel at 4 should be fine no matter what, and that is obviously obviously great for them. You know, as I talked about on day number 1, it's quite clear where they stand in my opinion and from my perspective in terms of what they are. They're not quite in the top 4. It feels like even Conviction right now is a bit of a half step, if not a full step ahead in terms of where everybody else is, but they are the best of the rest. And I think there is still the chance that they are getting better. Kenvy talked in the post-game interview here about how he really wasn't playing all that much at the beginning of the year and the beginning of the split, and he's really started to lock it in now that the team has kind of proven that it's not going to work unless they full commit, right? And obviously you want to full commit from the start, but if it's going to get better at some point, now is the time to do it. So let's go ahead and talk about it. Kenvy is the player that's going to be getting player of the game here. You know, kind of got robbed of it in terms of the game result on day number 1 because he was doing so much actively for his team against DarkZero, and it just wasn't enough to really push them across the finish line. But here against Kryra, he is good enough to be able to really separate himself. This was a phenomenal game for him on the Trundle. Kenvy is a player I've really believed in this channel's history, not only from his time in Tier 1. He was terrible. In Tier 1, I'm not going to kind of, you know, mince words. Immortals was terrible, and so it's hard to get a read on Kenvy, but he was not very good for that team. But more so on top of that, he's always been good at Tier 2. And for Supernova last year, I thought he honestly got a really bad reputation for basically no reason. This guy was consistently one of the better performing, if not the best performing jungler in the entire league for portions of last year. Obviously, you know, UG is the exception to that. It's not necessarily fair to put him in that category, but Kenvy was really good last year for Supernova, and I think people just kind of overlooked that because he wasn't the dominant number 1 that he had been when he was in the 100 Thieves system for a long time. So happy to see him continue to grow and kind of get back into that role. I was really hoping that he was going to dominate this split and kind of prove people wrong in that sense, but so far it's been inconsistently great. It's still been great, but it's just been a bit more inconsistent in terms of the actual raw execution. This was a great game from him. And I think Bradley ended up playing really well here. Bradley is another player who I think is so hit or miss across this split that when it hits, it's like unstoppable. Bradley's good games are some of the best in the entire league of any mid laner. It's just that some games he's kind of irrelevant. Like he can take a backseat role and kind of be a little bit less in your face as maybe some of the other mid laners. But again, if Kenvy and Bradley are on the same page, this team is dangerous. Instinct and Diamond are a good bot lane. Maybe not a great bot lane. I think I'm starting to kind of sway outside of that. And Philip is a very good top laner, but really is great at playing from ahead and is great at playing tanks and wants to make sure that he can be helpful to the team. He's not necessarily somebody that's going to salvage bad games. Citadel need quite a few things to go their way in the early game to be as effective, but when they are effective, we saw them take down Supernova. This team can beat anybody if they end up getting an early lead, and I think especially if Kenvy is going to continue to start leveling up his gameplay, this team could start to compete to be top 2 or top 3. They have that kind of talent. They've just not shown it consistently. And again, for Blue Otter, it's starting to become now or never for them. At 2 and 6, we already talked about 3 likely being the number needed to win. Their game at the beginning of tomorrow is super important towards their ability to try and salvage themselves, but honestly, they're pretty lucky to even have this record in the first place. They probably should be sitting at 1 and 6 in terms of how things have gone. I guess 1 and 7 in terms of how things have gone because they ended up getting that forfeit win over Conviction, who likely would have beaten them. Now, you never know. You don't want to speculate too much, and Blue Otter might have won that game. You just have no clue how things end up breaking down in that regard, but this team has been given a second lease on life, and it doesn't really feel like they've done a lot with it so far. Quacker is not having a good split. He's going to get dead of the game here. He's had many games where I'm just like, you gotta chill. Like, that aggressive feast or famine nature is absolutely still there, but I would argue that it's not really grown past what it was 2 years ago for him in the top lane. I still really like his mechanical upside, and I think he can be a good player, but at this point, I need to see some level of consistency, and I need to see him be able to survive in their losses, which he's just not been able to do. I think everybody else was okay here. Rovex, I think, has also had a pretty bad split. Talked about that at the beginning of the video. And then, Array, Samikin, Kryra. Samikin was aggressive and was doing damage on this way, but at times was too aggressive. If you're going to play really aggro on that champ, you need the rest of the team to back you up. And Neferi has been nerfed so hard that Kryra could never take over this game. I just don't really like the identity of this draft for Blue Otter, and I think they're in quite a bit of trouble heading into the final day, but Citadel, having earned their spot into the playoffs, is sitting pretty. We'll just see if they finish above or below 500 at this point because they've only got one more game to prove it, and now they're 4-4. But that's going to bring us to our third and final day of action in the NACL, both in week number 4 and in the regular season, as we will know our playoff picture by the end of this video. Kicking off the final day was a matchup between DarkZero and Winthrop University, two of our collegiate teams, our two collegiate teams, I guess, at this point in Tier 2, with Supernova obviously not being the Ole Miss roster anymore. And as it has gone the entirety of the year, DarkZero is going to pick up the victory. Maryville once again comes out on top, as they almost always do. do when it comes to these collegiate matchups, and they looked phenomenal. I think Winthrop had kind of gone through the ringer so far this week in terms of playing so many games, or I guess 2 games that were so close, and yet they lost both of them. It was really frustrating for them coming into the week at 500 and dropping to 3-6 at the end of the split. But at the end of the day, I don't think this team is really all that bad. I just think that they went up against good teams that kind of took some of their thunder. But DarkZero is genuinely very good, and this might be their single best performance in quite a while. What a run from them. Because again, Winthrop, I think, put up a fight, but they were nowhere close to being on the same level as DarkZero in this final game. So let's go ahead and talk about it. Player of the game is once again going to go to K on the top side. What a week from K. He's definitely going to be in the running for player of the week, with DZ going 3-0 and ending 7-2 in the regular season standings. He was awesome here. Obviously did all the damage on the Rumble and really was the one driving, I think, a lot of the game forward. If you wanted to give player of the game to Kizno or Zyko or even Toasty, I can kind of understand where you're coming from in that regard, because I think this team really functioned as a well-oiled machine throughout the entirety of this game. But for me, the damage coming in from K and just his general dominance, his positioning, the way he's able to impact the game, it was too good to pass up for me in this one, so he ends up getting the nod for player of the game. But like I said, Kizno just played his best game of the entire week, and he's already been very good throughout the rest of the week. I just think this was his most dominant performance. He really jungle gapped Wilson on the other side of this matchup. Zyko was phenomenal. I think he just played his best game of the week on the Milio. That Lucian-Milio combo hasn't always worked out here in the NACL, so it's cool to see it work for DarkZero. And then, of course, Toasty in the mid lane, getting 8 kills on the Orianna, still very effective overall. DarkZero just had a great game. They had a great week. They're sitting at 7-2 going into the playoffs. Do not be surprised if Maryville, DarkZero, whatever you want to call them, if they once again contend to win the entire league. They just do this. They did this last year, and they ended up picking up the win in summer. Again, do not be surprised if they do it again this summer. And then for Winthrop on the other side, they're still in an okay spot, not a great, like a perfect one to make playoffs, but depending on what happens in the next game, things could really start to get a little bit dicey for them. But at least for now, you know, going into the week at 500 and ending it at 3-6 is certainly not a good feeling. But again, tough competition across this entire week. Wilson is going to get done of the game here for game number 3. It really did kind of feel bad, I would say, generally speaking, for, you know, Wilson to play this one on the Wukong. He just couldn't really find any engage angles. I think Kizno did a great job of running the map and playing super aggressive. You draft this hyper scaling comp with Victor and Gwen and Senna, obviously, that really wants to try and scale into the late game, but Winthrop is a much better early game team than they are a late game team. They want to try to be able to snowball games out of control, and I think the moment that DZ realized that and just started taking a bunch of fights, Wilson ended up being very useless to this team as a whole, because there was no one to enable. I think you could point that out for multiple members. You could say that for Sword in the mid lane, who really didn't do anything all week long. If we're being entirely honest, he was never the biggest problem, but I think he never really felt like he was in any of the games. Mobility and only 35, I think, were fine at different times across this week, but at other times they were both pretty bad. Denethor was the only player that I think was consistently playing well for Winthrop, and I think generally he actually had a pretty good week. He was the one actively starting every fight for Winthrop that could have been positive for them throughout this entire game. There just wasn't enough gold on the Gwen to really do anything. So it's a frustrating loss. They're in a frustrating position, but DarkZero once again coming out on top and really cementing themselves as an upper tier team. Do not be surprised if they make a playoff run. I think they're going to be a lot better than people are giving them credit for right now. Then moving on now to game number 2 of the final day here, and game 2 was the big one. This really is going to determine basically everything at the bottom of the standings, especially for these two teams. It was CCG Esports taking on Blue Otter, and Blue Otter picks up the 45-minute victory in an absolute banger. This is the best game of the week. It's why I didn't want to specify that there would be a better game this week earlier on, because this one was yet to be talked about. This is everything for these two teams. And when everything is on the line, who can you count on more than Blue Otter? Once again, this team figures out a way to get themselves into a good position when they need to do it the most. After a tumultuous season, let's just be honest, they probably should have been in one of the relegation spots, you know, for most of the split in spring. You know, AMI, I think, at times played better than what Blue Otter were, but they were able to figure it out, and they were able to keep themselves alive. For most of this split, they're in a nightmarish position. They look like they're definitely going to be bottom 2. I put them bottom 2 in my power rankings. They're kind of saved a bit by a conviction forfeit. You know, again, I don't want to presume that they would instantly lose a game, because anything can happen in a best of 1, but they certainly wouldn't have been favorites in that game, and they have one opportunity here against CCG to make it happen, and they do. And they do it against a CCG team that very much stepped up here today and had Ocean Soul in this game. On Sejuani, on Cassante, on Nami, you had Ocean Soul, and you still could not take the win. It's disastrous for CCG. CCG, who is now actually in a very, very dangerous position, depending on tiebreakers, to be a team that's sitting at 3-6 and is outside of the top 8. I did not think that was going to be possible for CCG going into this week, but after 2 losses that they probably shouldn't have taken, they are definitely in danger. We can talk about the game because there is stuff to talk about, but really it's just going to be Blue Otter praise because once again, this team is so clutch. Array is going to get player of the game here. This Senna performance was phenomenal. I mean, about everything you could ask for out of a Senna player in the back half of the game. If you want good positioning, if you want maximized damage, if you want the ability to kind of really enable the rest of the team in the wombo combo that is like the Rumble and Ziggs ult that went off multiple times throughout this game, then Array gave you absolutely everything throughout this, and there's just nothing else to say. Like, this was one of those games where it's like, oh yeah, this is why Array is one of the best AD carries in Tier 2. It's because he can have performances like this. I know people doubt the upside, and people aren't really looking at him as a Tier 1 prospect, but this guy is crazy good when he gets to play his own style, and he really popped off in this game. But I don't want to take anything away from the rest of the team. Like I said, Samikin and Quacker were phenomenal. Samikin in particular, what a Ziggs game in this final performance to really be able to salvage a bad position. Those ultimates were perfectly placed. I think this Ziggs probably did more damage than any Ziggs we've covered on the channel in the past. It's just great stuff from Samikin. I thought Quacker just played his best game of the entire week. Kryra certainly just played his best game of the entire week, and we'll talk about it. It's Array going into his former team from last split. It's Music going into his former team from the last year and a half, and it's just such a big time for both of these players to have the moments that they had, and for Array to step up, for Kryra to be the better jungler here, for, you know, a Samikin to maybe have his best game of the entire split. Like, it's really just a great story for Blue Otter, and I'm happy for them. They're not out of the woods just yet. They could technically still be in a dangerous spot depending on tiebreakers, but they're certainly in a much better one right now. And for CCG on the other side, this is nightmarish. Like, this is worst case scenario. You had this game in the palm of your hands and you couldn't quite close it out. If you had won this, you would have been guaranteed playoffs, sitting at 4-5, and honestly probably in a pretty good spot to be a top 6-ish seed in the playoffs, depending on how things end up breaking down. As it is now, you are in real danger to not even make playoffs, to be one of the 2 teams that has to re-qualify for the NACL going into 2026. And there's nothing else to say. You did that with Ocean Soul. You did that with, you know, a lot of gold being on priority targets. It's just really unfortunate to see this team not be able to pick it up when it mattered the most. Unfortunately, I have to give a dud of the game. I think CCG does deserve quite a bit of credit for being in a good spot at the beginning of this, but Shogo's got to get dud of the game. He just didn't do enough damage and was out of position in the late game. There's nothing else to say. I think you can reasonably give this to Music in the jungle as well, but really when it came down to it, the difference in damage from Shogo to Array in these fights is kind of what ended up making it a Blue Otter win. And I hate to simplify it so much, but sometimes it really is just which carry can end up carrying. Young was not as good as he needed to be in this game, and I don't think Young played very well across this week in general, but I think Shogo's positioning was significantly worse, and I think his lack of aggressiveness really cost them. Music really ended up kind of underperforming in this big moment. How much can you do on Sejuani? I think that's up to you, but you have the Ocean Soul in the back half of this game. For you to not be fully, you know, tanking every bit of damage to allow your backline to get hit at all, I think is the problem of the tank in a game like this. I think everybody else was fine. Like, Fadachan had good moments on the Nami. Crimson was fine, generally speaking, on the Cassante. Even Music and Shogo, the players I'm criticizing, they were very good for a majority of this game. It all just came down to the little details where Blue Otter was just better, and they needed to be, and it might have just saved their lives, because as of now, CCG is looking to be in a terrible spot, and Blue Otter might have just gotten themselves into playoffs. They can thank, obviously, some lucky stars that they were even in this position to begin with, but don't put Blue Otter into a corner. They are going to blast their way out of it. Then moving on now to game number 3 of day number 3, and this was one that had less consequences as a whole, but still mattered for seeding. It was Citadel Gaming taking on Vancouver Impact, and Citadel picks up the dominant win, and honestly, how much do I want to talk about this game? I have no idea. Citadel lock in the number 5 seed guaranteed because they can't get top 4. The top 4 are all pretty separated in terms of their own records, and then everybody else below that can't get to 5 wins, and so they're kind of in their own tier, sitting as the 5th seed going into playoffs. It's not, you know, perfectly ideal. It means you do have to play a top 4 team, but you get to play the weakest, at least in terms of record, which is certainly at least a small boon. But most of the conversation surrounding this game in particular has to do with Vancouver Impact, because they certainly didn't go down quietly. Well, I should say they did go down a bit quiet in terms of how competitive the game was, but look at this freaking draft from Vancouver Impact. Alawi top, Rengar for Shimmer, which is always really fun, Shaco support. This is a real draft that a professional team ended up, you know, putting through absolutely insane stuff. But, I guess we can actually talk about what happened on the Rift. I just don't think there's much to talk about in that regard. Citadel picked a real draft, and Vancouver Impact didn't, and they got absolutely slaughtered. They were already a team that was, had their backs against the wall, we'll just say, and unfortunately they did not go out nearly as aggressively as maybe they would have wanted to. Philip is going to be my player of the game for this game. He was awesome on the Rumble. It really felt like he was the target for everything Vancouver Impact was going for. In the early game, they put so much tempo and pressure into trying to take Philip out of it, and all he did was absorb all of it and actually turn it into a gigantic, positive for Citadel. You can talk about Kenvi having a really great game here, but Kenvi's game becomes much more difficult if Philip is not playing as well as he is at the beginning of this. This really was one of those upper tier top laner types of performances. Only some top laners at this level can have this kind of performance in a game like this with this much tempo and pressure being thrown at them. So credit to Philip. He was incredible and really kind of changed the tide of the game in favor of Citadel. That doesn't mean we should take anything away from players like Kenvi, who also played really well throughout this game, but for the most part, Philip was kind of the driving force, especially in the early game, of why Citadel had so much pressure. But again, Kenvi was really good, ended up completely out-jungling Shimmer by the end of the game, and really when you look at the late game stuff, all of basically everything that happened after 15, 20 minutes into the game, that's where Kenvi was just the strongest player on the map, and he's going to be in the running for player of the week throughout this entire week because he truly was exceptional in that regard. Topside has kind of become a very big strength for Citadel, and it's going to need to be going into playoffs with all the good topsides that end up existing here in the NACL. Bradley goes Deathless. That's always a good sign. In the mid lane, Instinct and Diamond were really solid. I think Diamond is playing much better right now than he was at the beginning of the split. There were some up and down moments, but it feels like he's kind of settled in and adjusted. I still think this bot lane might be, maybe not top 4 in terms of how things are breaking down, especially with the emergence of Conviction's bot lane being so good for them. But I think everything else, you could make the argument they're top 4 in their own role. Philip is almost certainly a top 4 top laner. Kenvi is almost certainly a top 4 jungler. Bradley is at the very least in the conversation for top 4 mid laners. There's just a lot of good mid laners. It's not that Bradley's worse than those players. It's just one of those things. I think bot lane's really the only place where you would hope to see some improvement going into playoffs, and I thought Instinct was really good in this game. So overall for Citadel, they end above 500. I think that's generally a positive for a team that qualified into the NACL this split, but I think they have their eyes at even more, and I do think they are getting better. And for Vancouver Impact, this is a sad way to go out. This is their final NACL game of the year. Obviously, they go down to the promotion relegation tournament. There is a chance that they end up requalifying for the NACL. I don't think it's impossible. I don't think Tier 3 is necessarily brimming in the same kind of way it was when Citadel and even a Dorado were down there last split. I don't think there's quite a team that is obviously better than Vancouver Impact, but I think you're kind of expecting somebody to be able to be better than this team. They clearly just took a punt in this final game, wanted to play a lot of their signature picks. Shimmer gets his Rengar, which is obviously something he's played a lot of. Nukes gets Shaco. I have to assume he has a lot of experience on Shaco. Dragoon gets to play a Lowy in the top lane. It's just one of those games where everybody's just trying shit and seeing what sticks because you're not playing for anything. You're already eliminated, but Dragoon is still going to get done of the game because the Lowy had so much tempo and pressure put into her on the top side, and she did absolutely nothing with it. There was no positives on the top side for Vancouver Impact. Part of that was Philip playing well, but part of it was Dragoon just not being all that great. He did not have a good split. We'll have to see what happens moving forward, but definitely a bit of a disappointing showing from Vancouver Impact in general. And, as for moving forward, maybe they requalify for the NACL, maybe they don't. It's really hard to get a real clear reading on what exactly is going to happen there, but at the very least, they were able to make it back into Tier 2, and they got a sponsor that allowed them to play. I think we all would have been frustrated if this team had to sell their spot to somebody else just because they didn't have an actual org to be able to bring in. Vancouver Impact took a risk on Jolly Rogers, and just because it didn't pay off doesn't mean it wasn't worth the risk. But for Citadel, this is obviously, like I said, a pretty nice win. Getting that 5th seed and getting above 500 is good, but it's all really about whether or not they can compete with the top 4. But then moving on to our 4th game of day number 3, and do I even talk about this? Is this a game that we can even glean something from? It was Conviction taking on the number 1 team in the league in Supernova, and Conviction absolutely stomps them. A 0-kill game for Supernova, the best team in the league, for a content org on the other side in Conviction, and I get it. They're not really a content org at this point. They are genuinely competing to win the NACL, and honestly, I think it's fair to say that this team might even be be better, you know, wholeheartedly than Near Airport was in the previous split, not just because I think the league itself has gotten better, but because I think this is a complete roster. Everybody here I feel really good about heading into the future. I think TF Blade has gotten better, and I think every single other player on this team is playing like an upper tier 2 player at the moment. It's just ridiculous the kinds of performances they have. Their hands are insane. Like, the mechanics on this team are very, very clear, and I think unfortunately Supernova just learned why Riven has been banned in 100% of Conviction's games before today, because Viper ends up taking Riven down into the bot lane and decimates this game. He's not player of the game for me because I don't think he had enough of an impact on the game as a whole, but it certainly opened things up. Basically everyone on Conviction ends up getting their main here. TF Blade gets Jax on the top side. You know, Stunt gets Rakan, which I think is a champion he's played a lot of over the course of his career. I remember him back on the 100 Thieves days playing a lot of Rakan. Of course, Viper, rank 1 Riven, like, you know, top lane. You get it. Like, you understand why this is such a problem. Even Perry is such a good facilitator that Maokai fits perfectly into his own individual playstyle. You know, Evolved is really the only player that's not on, like, the signature champ. If it was a Katarina in the mid lane, that would have been ridiculous. But Conviction absolutely dominating either way is just unfathomable to me. I mean, it's really great stuff from them. TF Blade is going to be the one that I do give player of the game to on the Jax. It really did feel like this top lane matchup was a disaster for Supernova, and it wasn't just TF Blade. I want to give a ton of credit to Perry, who was basically just camping Hoarder on cooldown. Like, this was solo queue 101. Like, shout out Perry's YouTube channel. It's always been great. It will continue to be great. Friend of the channel, Perry. He would definitely teach you to camp the feeding lane, and I think that's exactly what he did here today with Hoarder's Jace just running it on the top side. Not looking good under any circumstance. Perry looked awesome in this one on the Maokai. Was just really impressed with it. But TF Blade is getting it for a lot of the plays he made after that as well. Not only did he continue to decimate Jace in lane and really expound on that top lane matchup, but his team fighting was really good on the Jax as well. Really no negatives to give Conviction, to give the top side of the map. Both TF Blade and Perry were absolutely phenomenal here. Viper, of course, is going to steal a lot of the attention away from the rest of this draft, and rightfully so. The Riven ended up taking over in the back half of the game, even if I think the game was already almost entirely decided by that point. You still got to give Viper credit for winning a professional game on Riven bot and, you know, not even surrendering a single death on the entire team to do so. It's just a really big accomplishment. Stunt was great on the Rakan. Evolved was sneakily very good on the Cassiopeia. Just a great game from Conviction, not really a lot to criticize. And then for Supernova on the other side, what a nightmare performance to end off your regular season. This is still going to be the #1 seed going into playoffs, I believe. Obviously, we'll check that out at the end of the video, but this is still a crazy situation, all things considered. Hoarder just had the worst game I've ever seen him play. He's done of the game. He got mega camped, and he fed his ass off. Like, there's just nothing else left to say. This was a terrible game from Hoarder, and it happens every once in a while, but it can't be happening moving forward. Dardoch had no pressure on the Trundle because he got completely outplayed by Perry on the other side in terms of map pressure, and his lanes got destroyed because of Perry and because of the individual gaps that were there. Blaze Olive had a terrible game. Breezy had a terrible game. Scary Jerry didn't get to do anything on the Corki. There's honestly not much analysis that I can give you in terms of why this game ended up breaking down for Supernova. Everyone lost. Everyone lost by a lot. The hands diff between these two teams was absolutely ginormous, and this is the best team in the league. Now, I am willing to say that maybe they weren't trying quite as hard coming into the final day, having already secured basically the top of the standings, but it is worth noting that this is at least a consequential loss. Conviction does get to 6-3. That puts them in a pretty decent position going into the playoffs, and obviously their confidence is now through the roof. I'm not saying that Conviction is going to win the league. I'm just going to say that Conviction can win the league, and the fact that that is even the case is absolutely ludicrous, but they just took the favorites going into playoffs and absolutely slaughtered them. I think this really makes the playoff race a lot more interesting, and in my opinion adds a lot of intrigue to what's going to happen. But that's going to bring us to our final game of the regular season here in the NACL. And as much as I'd like to hype this up as being a banger, it was a predictable outcome here as we saw Dorado Gaming taking on Luminosity Gaming, with Luminosity picking up their 7th win of the split. That does tie them record-wise for the top 3 with DarkZero and with Supernova. Because of tiebreakers, they land in the 2nd spot. It's Supernova at 1, Luminosity at 2, DarkZero at 3, but they are the 3 big favorites heading into the final part of the split here. I am super super excited to see how this breaks out because Luminosity, quite frankly, ever since getting their feet under them after the first couple of weeks, seemed to really be a team to watch out for in terms of just, once again, being the best. And I know that people are talking about this quite a bit. It's been a big conversation in the community, but we have to remember, these are all best of ones. Everything we've seen from all of these teams is what they can do in a best of one environment. If there is ever a team that is suited for best of 5 fearless, it's Luminosity. It's these players with ridiculously large champion pools and a lot of different, styles that they can go for. And you don't know if a team like Conviction or if even a team like the new version of DarkZero can kind of handle that same kind of pressure. Like Supernova, you feel pretty good about, but again, it's not like most of those players have had deep runs in the playoffs. It was really Hoarder last split on Conviction. You've got, Dardock, obviously, with his, history in Tier 1 and obviously having a ton of time there, but like a Blaze Olive, maybe, like he's definitely got the champion pool. Scary Jerry, should be fine, but again, there's question marks about it. And all I'm saying is that who's to say Luminosity is not the best team in the league still, and that they're not going to run playoffs now that they're back in form. For Dorado, not really a ton to talk about. They kind of just got blasted off the rift. Like, this was not a particularly close game. I didn't expect it to be particularly close. Dorado's not the kind of team that plays well against opponents that are better than them. From a hands perspective, it's why we saw them go 0-3 in their first 3 series. So we'll go ahead and talk about it here. For Luminosity, player of the game kind of has to go to Insanity in the mid lane. It really felt like the Corki was able to completely take over this one in terms of the damage. The mid-jungle duo was just so electric in terms of how Luminosity played the game. They started mid lane and they moved outwards, and typically you don't expect a Maokai Corki, mid-jungle duo to be so proactive, but when you're the better players in a game like this, you can really do a lot of things that you wouldn't normally be able to get away with, and I think that these two definitely kind of leaned into that. So credit to Insanity. His damage, again, was just absolutely ludicrous in the back half of this game. He was shredding everyone. When you're looking at like Azir and Yunara and Ivern on the other side, if you can get through that Braum, it's basically impossible for Luminosity to play the game. So, credit to Insanity. And again, credit to Tomio. He's going to be in the running for player of the week. What a great week overall for Tomio. One of the best players in the league, full stop. Once again, there were some reservations and some question marks about what Tomio was going to be, even from me coming into the year, just in terms of his playstyle and what he showed on Shopify Rebellion last year in the LCS. But I don't know, man. At the end of the day, he's still the best jungler at this level. Like, it just kind of is what it is. He continues to really be able to step up, and quite frankly, I'm not sure there are many better facilitative junglers in the entire region that includes tier 1 talent right now than Tomio. I think on the right roster with the right team around him, he can still be a top of the tier 1 type of player. Again, I just think his skill set is a little bit more limited because he's not aggressive in that same kind of way, but we did see some aggression in terms of like macro play out of him in this one, just, on Maokai, his signature champion. So credit to Tomio, credit to Insanity. Fake God was really solid. Ariana ends up getting a double kill on the top side and then teleporting into his own death. We'll talk about it. It's the funniest play I've ever seen. Tactical was good. Zazel was actually better, I think, than people are giving him credit for this game. This was mostly a 2-horse race for Luminosity with Tomio and Insanity, but still a good performance. And for Dorado, how do I not get it out of the way first? Ariana, that might be the single funniest thing I've ever seen is the adrenaline and everything flowing through him. He gets a double kill on the top side on this Jax. He's feeling like $1 million. He immediately TPs into a fight and instantly dies. It's one of the funniest, like, oh, oops, my bad moments I've ever seen in my life. It really is just like the adrenaline of a pro player. It's a really fascinating clip to watch, but outside of that, not a great game from Dorado. Just kind of is what it is. This team has not played particularly well against the top tier teams so far this year. Kaido is going to get dud of the game once again here. He did not have a very good week, I would say, overall for Dorado, and that's not entirely surprising. Again, I think Kaido, even from a skill set perspective, is someone I would expect to struggle against a player like Tomio, because Tomio's so good at controlling tempo and space, it doesn't really allow Kaido to start to, like, snowball games out of control. I just don't think you want Kaido going into a neutral game state against Luminosity. It's not really something that ends up benefiting him. Not that the mid game ended up going well, but everything kind of went wrong on the map. Shochi wasn't nearly as effective as Insanity. Now, part of that is the mid lane diff, but most of that is the mid jungle diff that ended up coming in. Sushi and Mixture never really got to play the game, and I already talked a bit about Ariana. It's just one of those games for Dorado. They still end up making playoffs, and at the end of the day, that's the important part. They don't want to be in the promotion relegation zone. They were in danger of that for the first couple of weeks, and so to see them even at 3-6, like, that's an okay enough record to make sure that you're okay, even if there is going to be another 3-6 team that does not make it and ends up in 9th. They have a lot of the tiebreakers. They have a lot of the goodwill from that record, and so they end up actually in a pretty decent position from a seeding perspective. But like I said, for Luminosity, this could very well still be the best team in the entire league. In fact, I think it's very probable that this is still the best team in the entire league, and I think Insanity in particular getting back into form is really convincing me of that. This mid-jungle absolutely dominated week number 4, and that is maybe the scariest sentence for every other top-tier team. All right, but that is going to do it for my NACL Week 4 overview and analysis video and the final week of the regular season here in the NACL. All that's left are playoffs, but up on the screen, as you can already see, we have some Player of the Week and Dud of the Week to get to close off the regular season before we jump in to playoff discussion. I'm not going to do an all-pro team. We got 9 best of ones. It just feels completely disingenuous to do an all-pro team. It does not feel, particularly valid or worth it to kind of go in that direction, but if you were to ask me who my MVP was, you know what? Do it for the content. Viper's my MVP. I don't care. I understand that he's probably not. Like, realistically, I'm giving it to Dardock. I think Dardock was exceptional, and he was on the #1 team in the regular season, but man, like, Viper was so fun to watch, and he won so many games for Conviction. Content MVP is going to Viper for the entire regular season, but for Player of the Week and Dud of the Week in Week 4, my Player of the Week, I did kind of deliberate over this, but I'm going to land on K, the top laner for DarkZero. I really do think he was that good over the course of this week. I think you can look at all 3 of their wins across this week and kind of look at K as kind of the primary person to really get them across the finish line in that regard. Really been impressed with his mechanics. I think he's going to be a really big deal at this level. And then my honorable mentions, Tomio. I think if you wanted to give it to Tomio, that's probably the obvious choice from this week for Luminosity. He was truly exceptional in all 3 games, and I think most people will give it to him. I just wanted to give some credit to K. And then Kenvi, the jungler for Citadel. I think he's almost under the radar at this point with how good he has been for Citadel, and I think especially that team feels like they are getting into form right now, more so than maybe even other teams around them in the standings. So Tomio and Kenvi are my honorable mentions, and unfortunately, Dud of the Week is going to go to Dragoon. It feels like I'm kicking a man when he's down. It never feels good to give Dud of the Week to somebody who's secured relegation, but sometimes it just is what it is. Sometimes you have to give a Dud of the Week to somebody like Dragoon because he was the worst player on the Rift this week. I think Dragoon is a very cool player, and I'm glad he got the chance to compete. I'm glad all of Jolly Rogers got the chance to compete, but didn't really end up working out for Vancouver Impact, so he ends up landing with Dud of the Week, while I said K does end up with Player of the Week. But we're not done with the video just yet. We get to transition into the bracket, the playoff bracket for the top 8 teams. Of course, CCG and Vancouver Impact notoriously, or I guess notably, missing here from this playoff bracket because they are 9 and 10. CCG somehow, after beating Luminosity in week #1, ends up missing out on playoffs. It feels incredibly shocking that that is the case, but Blue Otter's win over them in the final day ended up securing Blue Otter the spot over CCG, who would have been, I think, the 6th seed going into playoffs if they had just won that game. Genuinely absurd how close it was. I believe 6, 7, 8, and 9 all had the same record. It was all tiebreakers that ended up breaking down, which is just insane how that ends up working out. But we can go over the playoff bracket now. We'll go matchup by matchup, kind of giving my preview and thoughts because all of them will be in the next video. So, starting with Supernova versus Blue Otter, it's 1 versus 8. This one feels pretty obvious for me. Supernova are major favorites in this matchup. I would honestly be surprised if Blue Otter could even compete with them. I'd be shocked if they took a game. I like Blue Otter. I think they're in better form now, and you can never really count out the Otters, but Supernova are Supernova. I don't care about the Conviction loss. It does not bother me. I think they're going to be just fine, and I think they will easily advance to the second round. But that brings us to easily the most interesting of the first round matchups, Conviction versus Citadel Gaming. And the reason this has become so interesting is because while Citadel has been up and down, we'll just say, in the NACL, they are theoretically a team that would benefit a lot more from Fearless and from, best of series than a team like Conviction would, who, on paper, you're looking at them as a lot more meta dependent and really reliant on a couple of picks. Now, I don't think that applies to every player. I think players like Stunt and Perry, I expect them to be fine. Even Evolved, I think, has shown a pretty wide champion pool. But, Viper gets pushed to his 3rd or 4th champion. What happens? How effective is he going to be in that role? TF Blade gets pushed to his 3rd or 4th champion. He was not very effective in that role last split. So there are some question marks about whether or not Conviction is going to be able to succeed in this environment. Obviously, I'd love to be able to trust them, but I do think this is going to be a very close series, and Citadel is playing better right now than they have at any point. I'm going to go out on a limb, and I'm going to say Citadel wins this. I know that's not a very popular pick, but again, I just worry about Conviction in these best ofs. Please prove me wrong. I'm happy to be proven wrong. In fact, I would be very excited to see Conviction work out and actually be a contender because what we've seen in the regular season is astounding. Then moving on to DarkZero and Dorado Gaming. Again, a little bit of an easier one. Dorado really struggles with teams that can just hands check them in terms of how they play the game, specifically jungle. I think really struggles to be able to generate pressure when he's just down in resources, and you're going into Kisno, who's a very good early game jungler. I think bot lane is very much in favor of DarkZero as well, so I would definitely favor them in this matchup. I think people are undervaluing what they are right now. And then Luminosity versus Winthrop. Winthrop will find a way to make it close. This will somehow go the distance in terms of the series, but Luminosity will be able to take it. Honestly, honestly, if you ask me right now, I expect Luminosity to win the league. I think it's them and Supernova in the finals, and I think that's how it goes. I think Luminosity is still the best team in the NACL. I think they kind of proved that to me over the course of this week. Maybe I'm right, maybe I'm wrong. We'll have to see, but I think they've gotten better. I think they've leveled up over the course of this split. So those are my first round predictions. Let me know what you agree with or disagree with down in the comment section below. Very curious to know your thoughts and opinions down there, but that's going to do it. I do hope you guys enjoyed. If you did, leave a like. It really does mean a lot to me. Lets me know you guys are enjoying the content, and it does help get this video out to a lot more people, which I'm always very appreciative of. If you're new here, hit subscribe. We're going to be posting about every single series in the NACL playoffs as per usual, but of course we cover all 4 of the major regions as well, so LTA North, LEC, LCK, and LPL. I've been casting for LPL English. Again, plugs and links to that will be down in the description below, YouTube and Twitch. Go ahead and subscribe or follow depending on the platform, but stick around on the channel. We're covering everything. Hit subscribe and hit that bell so you can be notified when those videos do go live. But with all that being said, I hope you all are having a great day. I hope you continue to have a great day, and I will see you all